this topic, which I haven't done actually for quite a long time. And I will be presenting quite old results, which I fear some of you may hear for kind of the umpteenth time. But on the other hand, I will present quite new results, actually, and I think and hope that those are really interesting results for you as well. So also, I want to mention that I think this presentation closes the circle of this year's speaker series quite nicely, because I think also the first presentation was about terrorism and how to deal with terrorism. I would also like to mention that the heading is maybe a bit too broad, because I will precisely, or more precisely, be talking about Islamistically motivated terrorism. So not terrorism in general, and that is important because I can already tell you that the results that we did find do not necessarily transfer to other kinds of terrorism, or rather, I might say, terrorism with different motives. So this is the overview. So I will give you a definition of school shootings as I understand them and terrorist attacks. Then a definition of what I have called leaking. Then I present to you the findings on school shootings, which is the old part that some of you might already know. And then I will come to the findings relating to this Islamistically motivated terrorism, which is the very new part. And then I'll have a short discussion and outlook. And what we can derive from these findings. So first, as I said, let me quickly define school shootings, or maybe rather school attacks for you, because I know that everyone has kind of a different definition in their heads. So what we considered school shootings, or rather school attacks, are any targeted attack of a student or a former student at their specific educational establishment with the intent to kill and with potentially lethal weapons. So that means we were looking at the intent, not really whether the offense really succeeded in that sense. The offense is driven by individual motives that relate to and targets individuals and groups of individuals associated with this very educational establishment. So that means I'm not only talking about schools necessarily, but this definition would also include universities. As I already mentioned, the intention to kill would be sufficient for me to consider something a school attack. And we did also include offenses where weapons other than firearms were actually used. Right. So we did have, for example, in Germany, offenses where knives or an axe have been used. And what is also important is that the school did not accidentally get the place of the offense, or because it was a good opportunity, because you, for example, wanted to kill your previous partner, former partner, and you knew that this partner was working at that school, for example. Right. Okay, so that is school shootings, and then there's also, again, a lot of different definitions of terrorist attacks. I will first refer to the definition that is given by the Global Terrorism Database, which says terrorism is the use of illegal force and violence by a non-state actor to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. But in our research, we wanted to be a bit more specific than that. So again, we added the intention, at least, to kill people. Again, also the use of potentially lethal weapons. Then we considered terrorist attacks to actually have to take place in a public space, which may, of course, also be schools, but can be a lot of different other public spaces. And we also considered only those attacks, terrorist attacks, that contain kind of an element of surprise. So, for example, if the police would enter a house where they know somebody lives who owns weapons, who is not allowed to own weapons, and this person would, for example, shoot at the police officers, we would not consider this a terrorist attack because it wouldn't be very surprising, probably, for those police officers who entered this building. So why does it then actually make sense to talk about school shootings and terrorist attacks in one presentation, right? I don't know whether maybe some of you ask themselves that. So we thought about this as well, and we thought that there's quite a lot of common characteristics in the offenses on the one hand, but also in what we know about the offenders. So referring to the offenders, we do know that those are rare events, of course, so we do have a low base rate in general, but also those are high, so-called high impact offenses. That is, on the one hand, there are often multiple victims, and on the other hand, there's often a whole bunch of people who are affected either mentally or physically, or because some of their relatives have been affected, and so on and so forth. Then we consider these offenses to be single events in, as already mentioned, public spaces. We consider them both to have a symbolic character, and what is also most important, and which we will be talking about a lot in the following, is that although a lot of people often think that these offenses may be quite impulsive and offenses that result from people just snapping, they're actually not. Often, and most often, those are planned offenses that have been planned over long periods of time, and often there are also pre-selected targets. And as I was saying, both of these offenses also share the element of surprise. Then relating to shared characteristics of the offenders, we can say that those are mostly young men. Over 90% of the offenders are young men. Then we can see over the past years that we often find like a mixture of motives that has led people to argue that the actual offense that is then executed mainly also depends on which motives are accessible. And if the one motive is not accessible, it might be another one, right? So if you're, for example, not in contact with right-wing extremism and the justifications for this, you might become a school shooter. We can discuss whether you think that's true, but this is the reasoning. And what is most important for my presentation today is one specific finding that has been replicated for both school shooters and terrorist offenders a number of times, and that is that there are only unspecific risk factors and that there is no consistent offender profile. So you can have a lot of different risk factors in a lot of different combinations, and I will be talking about this a bit more later on. And this is not the same for everyone. So that makes it hard to predict who's going to become a school shooter or who's going to become a terrorist, also given that there's this very low base rate. So that means between those different kinds of offenses, there's still a lot of similarities, and that actually opened the opportunity for us, or at least we reason that might have the potential that we can harness similar starting points for preventive efforts, which is of course leaking, which I will be talking about later on. And I will give you a definition of this phenomenon shortly. First, I want to introduce like the reasoning that is standing behind leaking. When people were first trying to prevent school shootings, mainly in the US, because let's say, first of all, in the 90s, there was an increase in the frequency of school shootings. They started searching for starting points for preventive efforts, right? And what they started with was the identification of risk factors. So they try to find common characteristics of these offenders, trying to kind of identify them very early. And that resulted in so-called risk factor lists, right? And the reasoning behind this was kind of like a primary prevention approach, that if we know which are the risk factors, we can try to diminish these risk factors, okay? So that approach quite quickly encountered a lot of different problems, some of which I will mention here, and I have already mentioned them before. So what we found is that there were quite unspecific risk factors. So that means those risk factors could also be found in a lot of other people, which also means that they are quite frequent even in the common population, right? And that's even true in combination. And I will give you an example for this one. So imagine this is all the adolescents that we have in one country. And then one prominent risk factor that was mentioned over and over again for school shootings was violent media consumption. Now, we as aggression researchers do know that violent media consumption is quite common among adolescents. So are suicidal thoughts, for example. So is being the victim of bullying, and a lot of adolescents, first of all in the US, but also in other countries, if you want to, you can have access to weapons and you can gain access to weapons. And as I was also saying, you may also use knives, for example, as weapons. So if you follow that reasoning, actually everyone and every adolescent could have access to weapons. And as you can see, also in combination or even in combination of these risk factors, there would result a high proportion of adolescents that would be or had to be monitored because they might be at risk for committing such an offense. Now, obviously, that is not the case. The same problems arose, as I will also talk about a bit later on again, arose for terrorist attacks. So there were also hardly any risk factors that could be identified to apply to even most of the terrorist offenders. So there was one study that mentioned that among Islamistically motivated terrorists, the most common factor would being an engineer. Now, I don't have to mention to you that most of the offenders have not been engineers, for one, and that there's quite a lot of engineers in this world who have not committed like a terrorist attack, right? So that didn't work. So one additional problem is that these multiple risk factors also had different shapes. So for example, what does violent media consumption actually mean? Is this only playing violent video games, or what about music, for example, or watching movies and so on and so forth? And again, the low base rate is a problem because even clusters of risk factors may have just come about by chance. So, as I was already mentioning, no specific and no common offender profile could be identified. And because of these problems of the risk factors, they may not well be used for predicting who may become an offender. And that, of course, carries with it the high risk of identifying a lot of false negatives, false positives, right? And that may result in stigmatization that we try and want to avoid. So, but the research on school shootings also found some additional interesting results next to these risk factors. So what they did find, the early studies, was that the offenses are not spontaneous, but that they are planned, as I was mentioning, and that they are often the result of a long-term development towards these offenses. So what was shown is that the idea of the offense was present at least for one day, but also up to 1 year in almost all offenders. And almost all offenders as well had planned the offense over not only days, but mostly months. and at least 2 days ahead, 70%. So that wouldn't help us as well so much if it hadn't also been the case that these warning signs in the offender's behavior prior to the offense had been observable to others and had been noticed by others, which was also the case. So there were indications of a planning of the offense, a planning, not even only talking about them, was present in almost all cases as well, so 93%. An equal number of offenders caused attention, and at least, for example, in one adult, almost 90%, and in at least 3 different individuals, almost 3/4 of the offenders. And what is also important is that the later offenses were indeed in line with these previous announcements that have been made. So, and this is then what caught the FBI's attention first. So O'Toole, the first writer, who mentioned the phenomenon of leaking. And that is the official or initial definition that was presented by O'Toole in their manuscript in 1999. They called it leakage. And they said the leakage occurs when a student intentionally or unintentionally reveals clues to feelings, thoughts, fantasies, attitudes, or intentions that may signal an impeding violent act. So as you can see, this is quite a broad definition of a different sets of behaviors and attitudes and interests that might catch the attention of others. And then this definition also includes delineating different forms that leakage may take. So that may be subtle threats, boasts, innuendos, predictions, or ultimatums. They may be spoken or conveyed in stories, diary entries, essays, poems, letters, songs, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, a very broad definition of leakage that is presented here. And I do stress that because me and the people that I have been working with during our research has always sticked with this broad definition of leakage. And we have called this leaking, and this is getting important later on again. So this is why I'm pointing this out. So what was also said is that leakage or leaking whatever is particularly important because it's not that we kind of have to go out and look for certain characteristics to identify potential offenders, but rather that the potential offenders identify themselves by showing their interests in these offenses and signaling in a way that they might also think about doing something like that themselves. So that opens the opportunity rather for a secondary preventive approach by identifying those who have shown leaking and then responding to that leaking. So the present research that I will be presenting and the definition that I have always used in my research for leaking reads as follows. We consider leaking all thematically specific statements, attitudes, interests, behaviors, or acts. So that means thematically specific if somebody is really talking about, let's say, violence in their schools or terrorist attacks. I'm not interested, for example, in announcements of I want to beat somebody up, for example. That would not be leaking for me, right? So this is why I stressed this part, maybe more than it was initially done. So also thematically specific statements, behaviors, or acts by which potential offenders reveal their fantasies, thoughts, ideas, intentions, or plans for an offense prior to the perpetration in public that is at least potentially observable by non-approving individuals. So that is important because initially O'Toole also mentioned, let's say, diary entries. And I would say this is not leaking, because if I have a diary that is closed in my closet and nobody will ever see it, and maybe people don't even know that I have it, nobody will ever read it. But in order for leaking to be leaking, it has to be observable by people, right? Because otherwise we can't react to it. So, and taken together, these behaviors should signal an interest in an occupation with or a positive evaluation of an own offense, similar offenses, or related topics, or might even signal the planning of an offense. Okay, so I hope this is clear. And I will try to point out in more detail why this is so important. One further distinction that we have made is the distinction between direct leaking in the sense of thematically specific statements, for example, verbal statements, written statements, but also something like graphics, including comics or drawings, or other direct statements, for example, in videos or photos or websites. And this we distinguished from indirect leaking, that is rather thematically specific behaviors or acts or attitudes or interests. So, for example, interest in violence-related topics such as previous terrorist attacks, or maybe previous school shootings, right? Or changes, for example, in outer appearance, other changes in behavior, a strong interest in related topics such as weapons, for example, and so on and so forth. And those here are real examples, mostly those from existing school shooters. So I have stressed that we follow a broad definition of leaking, and I have done so because recently a lot of people have been following a much narrower definition of leakage, mostly in research on terrorism. And they have defined leakage only as the communication to a third party of an intent to do harm to a target through an attack. So while I think this is leaking, they think leakage is only this. And I'm not exactly sure why a lot of researchers here, including Milloy, but even O'Toole herself, have finally kind of limited the scope of the term. So they have distinguished, for example, different warning behaviors from leakage later on, as, for example, direct threats, identification with, for example, former terrorists, or fixation of related topics. But I always felt that they never quite could capture the whole definition of, or the whole phenomenon as leaking as I had understood it. So this is also why we stayed with this broad definition. So now, let's first come to the findings concerning school shootings. And as I was saying, those are quite old results that are at least 10 years old already. So, but you will see that all the reasoning actually is already based in these findings. So what we did find back then is that concerning the German school shooters, we could observe leaking in all school shooters, that it often occurred repeatedly within these school shooters, that it was mostly rather direct, but only sometimes detailed, which will also be important later on, that it was indeed thematically specific, and that it often occurred early in the development towards an offense, and often over longer periods of time, or long periods of time. And what is maybe most important is also that we found that it was relatively rare in the general public for once, and also compared to other risk factors in the general population. So this meant that we thought that already showing leaking per se indeed was an important warning sign that may be used, for example, for the prevention of school shootings, But of course, we do face the problem that there's still more people who announce an offense than really commit it, right? Although leaking is rare in comparison to other risk factors, it's still not as rare as the offenses. So that also meant that further assessment criteria are important. So, and I will tell you more about this in a minute. First, I want to point out in more detail, carve more out in more detail why then leaking is an important warning sign. So, because if it is observable and has a temporal connection to the offense and is rather rare or specific and is shown by almost all offenders, then we can really use it as a predictor, right? And I try to point that out here as well. So if you remember that those may be those we actually find maybe at risk, but also then add the much rarer occurrences of leaking, you can see that the number of people we have to look at gets much smaller than that. So when we started doing our research on leaking and how we might judge the seriousness of leaking, so that is what would be the probability that leaking would really result in an offense, there weren't very much criteria that allowed for the assessment of the seriousness of leaking. But there were criteria that were derived for threats. So that means you tell a person directly that you will hurt him or her. And to make it very easy, you could say the more detailed and the more concrete and the more plausible those threats were, the more they were considered to be serious, right? So, but there were some problems in that. So for one, we didn't know back then whether we could really transfer the knowledge from threats to leaking, because it's kind of a broader concept than threats. And we could already tell that those assessment criteria would only be applicable to certain forms of leaking. So that is only leaking that we would consider as direct. So, but what about, for example, leakings that were indirect, so shown rather via behavior or interests or attitudes? And also, what about, for example, gestures? Shooting, making a gesture to shoot somebody, for example, that cannot really be very detailed, for example. So indeed, when I did my PhD back then, I asked 6 of my colleagues to please rate all single leakings that I had extracted from 7 school shooters and 2 persons that I called leakers. So that were persons who did announce an attack, so they showed leaking, but they did finally not act upon their leaking, so they did not commit any offense. And I asked them to do this assessment on the basis of these criteria that I just showed to you, right? So what we did find then was really a group effect, but the group effect was not as we had it intended to be, because instead of the offenders showing higher seriousness assessment, it was the leakers who showed the higher seriousness assessments. And that was probably because the offenders did show much more indirect leaking than the leakers did, and they gave less details about their offenses than the leakers did. But as you can already see, the problem with this study is that it was quite a small comparison group, right? So, and I will come back to that later on. So, but what I derived from these findings was we can't actually use this criteria that were developed for judging threats, and detail is not everything. So I came up with some additional thoughts what might help. And one thing that I did say that might help was we might have a look at or aspects of leaking that were really specific for the offenders, and that were not shown by the comparison group. And that, for example, in my sample was a repetition of leaking of at least 5 times, so a minimum of 5 leakings per person, or mentioning, for example, a specific motive for the offense, or showing leaking here, for example, longer than 3 months, and so on and so forth. I also computed a sum of criteria. I just added up how many criteria that I had extracted that were about, like, I think more than 40 criteria. And then I checked how many criteria did every offender and every leaker show. And as you can see, I did find kind of a difference, at least. So I reasoned maybe if we have a better look at the sum of criteria, that would make a difference, right? And would tell us something about the risk that a person was carrying. And I also thought, now I'm here, I'm jumping to here, that we might also try to weight specific criteria, because the specific criteria might be specifically important in order to tell us whether somebody is really willing to commit an offense. So, for example, if somebody is already trying to prepare an offense, try to get access to weapons, for example, this may be particularly important. And also, for example, if we have certain combinations of different forms of leaking or different contexts of leaking. So a first summary would be that we concluded that leaking per se is an important warning sign, that leaking does not always have to be detailed, because also indirect leaking is important, and that leaking can only be judged in total. So we can't say anything about like single leakings, but we always need to know or get a lot of information about a person so we can judge, has there been more leaking, has it been shown over longer periods of time, has it been versatile, and so on and so forth. So that meant that we actually needed like a larger sample, and first of all, also a larger comparison sample. However, back then I finished my PhD, and that was actually when I kind of stopped for a while doing research on leaking and school shootings, although I always thought that this aspect of leaking was really the most important work that we had done on school shootings. So finally, many years later, when I found out that there might be funding for projects that try to prevent terrorist attacks, I came back to this thought and thought, yeah, maybe we can also use leaking in order to prevent terrorist attacks. And maybe we could, drag the research on leaking a step further by really having a look at how we can judge leaking better in order to aid risk assessment procedures and to determine whether a person really poses a risk of committing an offense or not. So, and this is now what I'm coming to, because then we initiated the Lateran project that was concerned with leaking as a warning signal for terrorist attacks. And my own research group then indeed investigated religiously motivated offenses, more precisely Islamistically motivated offenses, while our cooperation partners, for example, investigated right-wing terrorism. And as I was already saying, their results have been different from ours, so I will only present the ones on the Islamistic attacks. Our research questions were to get a better idea of how leaking in terrorist attacks actually looks like, whether we could identify criteria for the assessment of the seriousness of leaking, and then how we could make this knowledge accessible to, for example, members of the law enforcement authorities. So why did we do that? because we did have some indication that also the terrorist offenders showed leaking, or rather leakage. And that was back then up to 80%. And that also seemed to apply for the German offenders. And obviously, or seemingly, they had also shown leaking over longer periods of time. However, the research back then still also focused on risk factors and the risk factor lists. They employed the narrow definition of leaking, so we weren't really sure whether they would capture all the aspects that we would consider as leaking. They often analyzed media reports, and we weren't sure whether media reports would capture actually all leakings that were relevant. And they did mainly frequency analysis. So there were reports of 80% of the offenders show leaking, but there were no further analysis of content, for example. And two further limitations were that the research was mostly limited to single offenders and that there were hardly any comparison groups. And that we tried to change. And what we did is that we analyzed prosecution files of, in total, roughly 80 cases with 100 individuals who had shown in total the 732 leakings. Every single leaking was analyzed itself in very much detail. So we did have a look at the contents, for example. And these 100 individuals were spread on 27 so-called core cases with 48 offenders. So those were offenders who had actually executed an offense or had planned an offense, but were prevented to execute the offense. And then there were 52 comparison cases with 52 individuals. That were persons, again, leakers, who had announced an offense but not executed an offense, and obviously also not planned an offense. So in those two groups, we did finally compare. And I will give you some information about the core cases first. So almost all of them, 96%, did show leaking. So again, we derived from this fact that leaking is an important warning signal per se. There were a lot of repetitions of leaking. So on average, the offenders showed 12 leakings with a range of 0 to 55 leakings. The duration was roughly 1 year on average, ranging between 0 to 5 years. And concerning the time periods, most of the leakings occurred within the last 3 months before the offense was committed or prevented, or the people got known to the police. And maybe I will not go into all of this. I just want to also point out the trajectories. So what we could see is that the leaking became more offense related over time. So in the beginning, there was just like rather general comments of wanting to take part in fights, also abroad, not necessarily in Germany. And then later on, there was a clear intention, for example, to commit an attack that was also communicated to others. But what is more important, and I will skip this, is that we could also find differences in the contents and the forms and the duration and the repetition, for example, of leaking between the core cases and the comparative cases. And we did this comparison, comparing here 84 characteristics of leaking in total between the two groups. And we did find 32 significant differences in these contents or forms or whatever between the two groups. And we then further selected 16 out of these 32 characteristics that really made a difference between the two groups. and put them together into an instrument that would allow for the assessment of leaking. What we also did before, when we did that, is that we try to figure out, are there criteria that should be weighted, specifically weighted, and which would be the cutoff criteria that would distinguish between offenders and perpetrators. And what you can only half see here is the instrument, because due to security reasons, we are not allowed to show the specific criteria. Well, what you can see is that there are criteria here, for example, that get specific weighting, and that if you, for example, have this criterion, you get a point, and then you get a total score that is automatically computed, and then you can compare the total score with the risk evaluation or risk assessment, which shows you whether there's a low, rather low, moderate, high, or very high risk for this person to commit an offense. And that is that we have this empirically based standardized risk assessment tool, which may be used by law enforcement authorities or therapists, for example, that provides a comprehensive, objective, and comparable, transparent result that helps to assess the seriousness of leaking on the one hand and the risk for an offense on the other hand. So that is, it may complement other risk assessment tools that often have a stronger focus on risk factors, now adding the aspect of leaking to this. And it is suitable as well for male as well as for female offenders, and also for single offenders as well as group offenders. And you may also use it if the persons did not show any leaking, because we also considered further warning signs that have been shown by all persons in our sample apart from leaking. And that is, and maybe I come to an end quickly now, that is the first results that we have with our initial sample of 100 persons. So as you can see here, the perpetrators were rather identified as having a high risk or a very high risk, and those who did not were often group offenders, where the other members of the group did show high values. And also you can see here that most of the comparison cases were showing or assessed to show a low risk or a fairly low risk. So that means concerning ROC analysis, we did find quite a high area under the curve of over 0.9. And for example, if we considered the moderate risk as the cutoff criterion, we did have a sensitivity of 92% and a specificity of 65%, which increased if we set the cutoff for the high risk, right? And maybe I would like to mention another finding that is also important, because we already did one evaluation of the instrument using an independent sample that was not used for developing the instrument itself, but that we also accessed either via media reports, or we had one additional verdict from the year 2000 that we had not included in the initial sample. And what we found for those in total 30 persons, 18 perpetrators and 12 leakers, was roughly the same finding. So as you can see here, again, the perpetrators, also if we only used mostly media reports, showed a high risk or a very high risk, whereas the comparative cases mostly showed a moderate risk at the highest. So again, the area under the curve was at least quite good. And again, the values for sensitivity and specificity were quite comparable to what we found earlier. So that means probably that the instrument can be transferred and also used with cases that were not included into the initial development of the tool on the one hand, and also that the criteria can also be used by other writers, because at least in part, the writers that coded these 30 additional cases were not the same as those who had been working on the